We begin this hour with our NBC News team, White House correspondent Monica Alba, international correspondent Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Also with us, Samantha Vinograd, former DHS Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, who worked on Iran policy under 3 different presidents. Monica, catch us up on the president's thinking. Who's he listening to and why he may be considering a strike on Iran?
Yeah, and there were a couple of other relevant comments from what you just played there, Anna, that took place last hour, which was he told reporters that in his most recent conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he told him to, quote, keep going, to continue with whatever they have planned as they continue to exchange fire with Iran. So that was notable. And he was also asked about something that he had posted on social media yesterday where he wrote, "Our patience is wearing thin." He was asked at what point essentially does that patience run out? And he just told reporters that it already has. So, of course, this is a precarious moment. It is a time where the president was answering many, many questions on this very fragile moment in foreign policy where he was a little bit ambivalent about whether he has made a decision or not. But in terms of your question of who he's listening to, we know that he huddled with some of his top military advisors and some of his top cabinet officials yesterday, but that it sounds like he's really also been in touch over the last couple of days with key world leaders on this. We know that he spoke to President Putin of Russia over the weekend. The president says that the Russian president offered to mediate potentially some conversation between the U.S. and Iran. The president just moments ago said he spoke to President Putin again yesterday. We're checking on whether he means a new phone call or that phone call from over the weekend. But a lot of questions still here about what the U.S. involvement could be. And we know that, again, he may have been presented with a menu of options yesterday, but he has been inching closer to implying and trying to set out the rationale for the U.S. further diving into this conflict and perhaps providing some military offensive support to Israel. We just don't know if he has authorized that, asked for that, approved that or not. Anna.
Sam, we know Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is still testifying in the Senate, but so far has refused to publicly say if he has given the White House options for a possible Iranian strike or a strike against Iran. What could those options include, do you think?
Anna, we have had detailed military options to take out Iran's nuclear facilities for over a decade. I've been part of those conversations in the Situation Room. And those options really require the use of a heavy bunker buster bomb known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. Only the United States really has the capability to deploy that weapon with our B-2 bombers and to strike at Iran's underground facilities. If other assets are used, other offensive capabilities are used, we could set back the program a bit, but that Massive Ordnance Penetrator would really be what would do irreparable damage to Iran's nuclear program. Other military options could include, on the defensive side, more air defense support for Israel, as well as potentially launching ballistic missiles of our own into Iran itself. But those detailed military options have been on the table for a long time. And the question is whether President Trump is going to pull the trigger, no pun intended, and allow the United States to deploy our B-2 bombers and this bunker buster bomb.
You said you've been inside the Situation Room. What do you think those discussions are like? What are the pros and cons these national security heads are all weighing, or the risk-reward of potential U.S. action inside Iran?
Well, Anna, I know this president has a unique relationship with intelligence, but at the end of the day, the most important part of any Situation Room discussion at this time is what the intelligence community is briefing and whether the president is listening to it. In every Situation Room meeting I was in, the meeting kicked off with an intelligence assessment. In this case, it would be an intelligence assessment about the Iranian regime, really the supreme leader's intentions, whether the supreme leader intends to break out to a nuclear weapon and whether the supreme leader intends to keep Iran fighting or for Iran to go to the negotiating table. That intelligence assessment should be guiding the president's decision-making. And from there, the second most important part of this discussion, perhaps even more important, is the safety and security of Americans in the region. And I am concerned, Anna, that this White House has not yet helped Americans in Israel to depart. And so I believe part of the deliberations, based on my sources, relate to whether the U.S. will engage in assisted departure for Americans in Israel while considering these military options.
Coming back to the nuclear abilities and capabilities of Iran and this Fordo nuclear facility, how much does the U.S. really know about that facility and the potential fallout of striking it, Sam?
The United States has good intelligence on the status of Iran's nuclear program. At the same time, the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, has issued a public assessment of Iran's progress as it pertains to its nuclear program, namely the amount of what we call highly enriched uranium, or the material needed to break out and build a weapon, that Iran is currently stockpiled. What is really under review is whether or not the Iranian regime has actually decided to break out to a bomb. That is where the intelligence assessment just a few weeks ago indicated that the Supreme Leader has not made that decision. DNI Gabbard reiterated that assessment a few days ago, and I believe President Trump said he disagreed with that assessment. So we do have decent intelligence on the state of Iran's nuclear program, but there does appear to be disagreement between President Trump and intelligence professionals about whether Iran has decided to break out to a weapon or not.
Matt, what is the feeling right now there in Israel? Do they want U.S. help? Are they rallying around Netanyahu right now?
I mean, the people that I've been speaking to really do want to see U.S. help. And some of the things that I've been hearing is kind of like, well, why doesn't the U.S. just give Israel the bunker buster bomb that's needed in order to penetrate that Fordo facility that we keep hearing about? You know, there is a lot of anxiety about the fact that we've just endured bombings for the past couple of days. But I do have to tell you that over the past 2 days, over the past 48 hours, we haven't seen a fatality from any of these Iranian counterattacks. We haven't seen many injuries. Most of the injuries, according to the Ministry of Health here, are from people who either tripped and fell while they were running to these safe homes or safe rooms, or they had anxiety. So really, we're seeing a big turn in the Iranian response. So for the home front here, things are starting to look up. The Israeli authorities are lifting restrictions on people's movement. So it looks like people, and that's going to happen around now. So it looks as though people are going to start to move around the city a lot more if they trust what the government is saying. And I think most of them do. So I think that this is a situation right now where everybody is just sort of waiting to see what's next. But there's some level of optimism here.
And Matt, we were speaking with Yasmin Vasugian about what's happening inside Iran right now. There were new Israeli strikes just this morning in Iran. What's your sense, and what are you hearing there in the region about where the Iranian people stand on possible regime change? Because there seems to be no organized opposition waiting to seize power.
No, there doesn't. And I've been asking Israeli officials about who would possibly be working with the Iranians on the ground, whether or not they have partners on the ground who can affect this regime change. You know, one of the things that we've heard from the military is that their military orders are to destroy Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Those orders do not include necessarily moving beyond that and trying to unseat the regime. And yet we've been hearing from Israel Katz, the defense minister, today, saying that they've started attacking things that aren't necessarily strategic, intelligence headquarters, the state propaganda arm. And, you know, they're really threatening not just the nuclear program, but also the entire regime. While at the same time, it's unclear whether they really have that day after plan. You know, and I think you can see this in a lot of the theaters where Israel has been fighting over the past year and a half. Overwhelming Israeli military superiority, but no real set plan for the day after for a political solution that could ensure longer-term peace.
And Monica, President Trump has certainly been critical of regime change in the past, but then yesterday he was posting on social media that he knows where the Ayatollah is hiding, but won't, quote, take him out for now. Do we know the president's thinking on possible regime change, where his head is on this specifically right now?
Yeah, and the White House had been saying in the last couple of days that that is not what it was looking for. Over the weekend, we had reported that, in fact, President Trump had rejected joining an Israeli plan to potentially assassinate the supreme leader. So this is an area where I think you're seeing a little bit more of the heated rhetoric and perhaps some bluster on social media from President Trump, as opposed to making some real policy implication in real time, though the repercussions are significant. But we are now also getting a response from Iranian officials, specifically to what the president said a short time ago, which is that he implied there had been direct outreach from someone in Iran to come to the White House, to come for some potential meetings, to perhaps resume some of those diplomatic talks. But Iranian officials, the Iran mission to the UN specifically, is responding saying no Iranian official has ever asked to grovel at the gates of the White House. The only thing more despicable, the Iranians say, than his lies is his cowardly threat to, quote, take out Iran's supreme leader. So that certainly had reverberations around the world when he posted that, as he often does on his social media, doing foreign policy on the fly.
Yeah, Sam, what would a regime change in Iran mean for the U.S.?
Well, that's hard to know, Anna. It's hard to know what would come next if the supreme leader was not in power any longer. I do think that the news leaking that Israel asked for President Trump's permission to assassinate the supreme leader, and then, of course, President Trump's Truth Social tweet about Khamenei and knowing where he was hiding, certainly send a message to Iran that both Israel and perhaps the United States have excellent intelligence on the supreme leader's whereabouts. That unto itself, along with Israel being able to launch a significant intelligence operation and military operation against Iran without Iran detecting that it was underway, are unto themselves a black eye for the Iranian regime. The fact that Israel thinks that it is capable of finding and assassinating Khamenei certainly publicly indicates that the Iranian regime is no longer capable of protecting its most prized assets.